welcome to this edition of Bates Nursery Botanical Bootcamp. I'm Ben with Bates Nursery. Like I said, filling in for Austin today for hydrangeas. We're going to talk a little bit about different types of hydrangea, give you a gist of what we're kind of going on, and then we'll talk more about specific pruning. Generally speaking, this is a good time of year to prune just about any hydrangea, depending on what you're doing. So it's a really good time to talk about it, even though what we're going to be looking at is a lot of leafless hydrangeas with some mushy blooms, excuse me. And that's typical for the garden, so we're just going to look at cleaning those up. But let's get started. I'm going to kind of move down to a book I have here on the table to give us an idea of different types of hydrangeas, what to expect from them. I recently got a photo encyclopedia of Michael A. Durr. Some people might be familiar from the Woody Plant Manual that a lot of people use. It's basically a full color edition, so we can kind of get an idea of what these plants look like in a mature state. So I'm just going to open a hydrangea. Okay. Does that look okay?
Okay. Cut them up a little bit from the bottom. There you go.
Okay. I've just kind of opened this to hydrangea, and we'll just kind of go over real quick different species and kind of what to expect as far as pruning season with them. So generally, as I said, it is a good time to do pruning on hydrangeas, including hard cutbacks. And as well as fertilizing, you can really do that generally anytime. You could do it right now and into the spring for hydrangeas. But first, we're going to look at kind of, we'll just go alphabetically here. The first hydrangea right here is Petiolaris. Now, this is a climbing hydrangea. We usually kind of exclude this from the rest, but I'm going to mention it. Hydrangea Petiolaris. And that's climbing hydrangea. This is a plant I really wouldn't worry about pruning, deadheading, unless you're trying to keep it shaped or keep it cut back. Basically treat this as a regular vine, so as a rose, really any other climbing vine, honeysuckle. Treat it in the same way, really prune it anytime, and that's Hydrangea Petiolaris. Hydrangea Arborescens is the other one we'll be talking about. And here's a picture of Annabelle, which is really the most popular variety. Just to give you an idea of how big they can get, including how big the blooms can get. There's one variety of smooth hydrangea called Incredible, which tends to put blooms on almost the size of a soccer ball. I mean, they are amazing. So we'll talk about Hydrangea Arborescens or smooth hydrangea. Hydrangea Macrophylla, which is when people think hydrangea, this is really the first thing that comes to mind. So you're going to have blues. This is just a straight species, all the way to pinks, depending on soil acidity. And I will mention what you can do to change that. So when we're talking Hydrangea Macrophylla, we're going to be looking at big, typically rounded blooms, pink to blue. Let me see if there's one here that we carry a lot of. Endless Summer, that's kind of one right here I'm pointing to. Endless Summer is one of our best sellers. These will go pink to blue, and they tend to also bloom on new wood if they are in a really good fertile situation. They can set new buds in the middle of the summer to get you a second set of blooms without pruning. So that's a really nice addition. Here's another example of a Nico Blue. Probably one of my favorite hydrangeas. Just give you an idea of scale. I have seen these 10 foot tall, 10 foot wide easily in a bed. So just an idea for placement. Hydrangea Paniculata. This is also known as a Panicle Hydrangea or a PG Hydrangea. This is probably one of our best sellers here for sunny situations in the South. Limelight is the one most people are familiar with. As well as PG and Quickfire are definitely the most popular varieties. Let me see what we have here. Penny Mac, Blushing Bride, which we typically carry, and then the Twist and Shout, which is a newer variety of kind of a lace cap, but these will still do the pink to blue coloring. I'm sorry, that's a Macrophylla. We'll turn the page here. Here's your Paniculatas. So PG, just to give you an idea, some of these Paniculatas can literally turn into trees without pruning them back. Here's a better example of Limelight, probably the #1 selling hydrangea in our area. Big, panicled, green to white blooms on those. Really a sturdy hydrangea, as well as Quickfire. So you can get an idea of, you'll get a color change from Quickfire into more of this reddish tone that Pinky Winky has. And I believe we have one more, Hydrangea quercifolia. So this is the oak leaf hydrangea. This is kind of the more naturalized hydrangea with the really long candle-like blooms on them. Really popular for the back borders of gardens. As you can see, if you look, this is the first story of a house. They can get rather large generally, unless we go for the dwarf varieties. So just be cautious where we're placing these. And I'll do a little bit of a mention on Hydrangea Serrata. These have become more popular in recent years, also referred to as a mountain hydrangea. We're going to take care of these just like the Macrophylla, the big leaf hydrangeas. And so we're going to treat them the same way. The big difference is bloom shape, texture of the plant. See if I have a good picture of one. Yeah, so here's a good idea of some mountain hydrangeas. Typically a little bit looser, a little more airy, a little more naturalized, but still with the colors of the Macrophylla. These are really doing well in the landscape, and it's a really good option as they breed more varieties of those. All right, so we've kind of taken a look at just kind of pictures of what these should look like in the summer, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. And then we'll kind of go on to look at more pruning for each hydrangea and exactly what we mean by old, new wood and how that should dictate how you're going to prune. So we'll just kind of reset and go through the hydrangeas again with a little more of a hands-on. I do want to go ahead and reiterate that late fall through winter are great times to prune hydrangea, as well as maybe doing some fertilizer to change your soil acidity, deadheading, hard cutbacks, and then also shaping and tightening these for the next year. One thing I do want to say generally on all these hydrangeas, it's a good idea to avoid early fall pruning. Really from here on is a good time. What we are worried about in the landscape is pruning too early and having warm weather like we had this past week. In that case, you can get excessive growth after pruning, and that is susceptible to frost damage. So it's really ideal to wait until these plants are truly dormant. No new growth is seen for a few weeks, and then we're safe to do pruning. Okay, first we're going to talk about Paniculata. Like I said, the most popular Limelight Hydrangea is probably one of the #1 sellers for us here. This is typically going to be on new wood as far as hydrangeas go. Let me see what I have here. Okay, so I have a Limelight here, and this one has not been cut back. So the Limelight hydrangeas, we're going to typically cut these back to reduce the overall size. You can deadhead them just to make them look a little more presentable through the winter, but it's typically recommended to do a cutback up to 2/3 on these. That will kind of give them a little more stability, a little more structure to hold those blooms the next year. So let me grab my pruners here. So deadheading, these don't really have blooms left on them. But if we had a bloom, we'll kind of here on the end. With that bloom, when you're deadheading, we will just typically come around the plant and snip just below that bloom. You can obviously go further back, but if you're just trying to shape the tree and cut those blooms off to make it look better, just below that bloom, preferably to that first node. And you could easily come through the plant and do that with all of these. So I'll just go ahead and do a little deadheading, pretending there's still blooms on these. And what that's going to do is just give you a little better look than mushy blooms on sticks. What I prefer to do to panicle hydrangeas is give them a good cutback. A lot of times 2/3 is a good rule. And if you look at this plant, you can really see where it has been cut in previous years. And that's about 2/3 down on the plant. So you can use these old cuts as kind of a guide where you should go. So I'm going to go ahead and show y'all how to do a reduction pruning to really get these plants a little tighter for next year. So we're going to go down about 2/3. Ideally, we're going to go right above a node. So we're going to come down to this guy, and we're going to go right above that node. And you can see where the old previous cut is. You could easily go below that cut. But generally, I like to go up just a little bit. That way we can get more branching out of this hydrangea. We'll go ahead and do this to the rest of them, just so you can get an idea of what it'll look like after pruning. Again, this is a Limelight Hydrangea, Hydrangea Paniculata or Botanical Hydrangea. Typically, we're going to see these in full all-day sun, and that's where they're going to get really extra stout and sturdy stems. If you have these in too much shade, there is a good chance that they will, as we call it, flop, because they're not strengthening up their stems. Kind of leave this here. Almost done here. Okay, so for me, that would be a good start. You could always come in and clean up this hydrangea. It's not really going to make a huge difference for the next year. But you can see we've taken about 2/3 off of this hydrangea. It should grow 2 to 3 foot the next year. And that will bloom just fine if we prune it this time of year. Don't be afraid of a panicle hydrangea. They are really very tough and hardy hydrangeas, really resilient. No matter how you maintain them. Again, there are other varieties. Quickfire is one of my favorites. It's got a more open bloom. It'll turn a really nice fiery red in the fall. The good thing about panicle hydrangeas is they tend to keep their blooms sometimes well into the winter. I'll use those as cut flower arrangements, stick those in vases. It can really kind of keep on living through the winter. Okay, so arborescens is what I want to talk about next, the smooth hydrangea or the Annabelles. I have an Incrediball here on the table. And this guy's actually not in a bad state right now. I mean, you could easily leave this and it would be just fine through next year. If they were 4 foot tall, I would definitely cut them back. What you're going to end up with if you don't trim them is just excessive growth on top. And these are notorious for wanting to fall over if they grow too tall in a season. So with an Annabelle Hydrangea, we're really looking at old and new wood blooms. They very readily put blooms on new wood or what you get during the year. I will typically prune these back midsummer and get a second set of blooms on them early fall, late summer. So they're very quick to rejuvenate. One of the few hydrangeas that'll really thrive in the shade. Let me see. So 2/3 or more is a good rule for these Annabelle hydrangeas. Again, this is an Incrediball, a different variety. They put on bigger blooms, and they do tend to put on a stockier stem to help you hold that bloom. So I'm going to show you kind of another 2/3 cutback on this. Because this isn't that big, I'm probably not going to go back as far, but you can see where previous cutbacks have happened about halfway down. That's probably where I'm going to take this one. You could easily go 4 to 6 inches up from the soil if it's really become kind of floppy in past years, just to strengthen it up. So I'm going to go ahead and do some cuts about halfway down on this one. And there are some little buds and some nodes. I'll try to cut right above those. That way we can salvage those for next year. And it seems like you're doing an awful lot of damage to the plant. But a lot of times this will really encourage that growth in the spring. All right. So this one's been cut back pretty low. Let me show you the other one that we just did. So here's the Limelight and here's the Annabelle. You can see I really don't mind cutting these Annabelles back pretty hard to give them a little bit of firmness the next year. Again, you can deadhead these if they seem nice and sturdy for you. You do not need to cut them as far. But I wouldn't hesitate on the Annabelle, the Arborescens hydrangea. Okay, oak leaf is what I wanted to talk about next. And we have a big 7-gallon, this is a peewee hydrangea. So Hydrangea quercifolia or quercifolia. These generally bloom on old wood exclusively. So whenever we're talking about old wood, we're talking about buds on this previous year's growth. And so if we do excessive cutbacks on these, we do risk losing our blooms next year. So I would recommend not pruning these if you don't have to. I mean, if the shape is nice, they do well for you, and you want them to grow a little bit every year, leave these alone. And you'll be assured you're going to have blooms the next year. You could easily deadhead those blooms. This really doesn't have any to deadhead, but again, snipping just underneath where that flower is, that way we do get blooms right behind it where you cut that flower off. If we cut it too far down, we only have maybe a few buds to even try to produce flowers. So the less you cut, the more flowers you should get the next year out of these. But typically these are used for more of a naturalized look. So most people do tend to let them get a little big, a little rangy. One of the benefits of these is this nice kind of peeling cinnamon bark. If you leave these old canes in here, that bark will get showier and showier as it gets older. Then again, it depends on what you want it to look like. So deadheading. Cutting back less than 2/3 is generally my rule on these. I would not be cutting these down to the ground. And then thinning old canes, which is something I would do more on this hydrangea than the others. And when we're talking about thinning old canes, if you've noticed that it's gotten a little bit rangy or part of the plant has really just not performed well, and it's starting to get big, like maybe thumb-sized or bigger, that may be an old unproductive cane. Like we see on roses, you can prune those out of the plant to help rejuvenate them and put on new growth elsewhere. Then again, if you cut off a main cane, obviously you won't get blooms where you cut it. So let me go ahead and try to do an example of a old cane prune out of this. Now this hydrangea looks just fine, but if I look in here, there's kind of some ragged old canes that maybe look a little out of place. And if I want this to rejuvenate more, let me see what I'm talking about. This kind of one in the middle is kind of a little bit busy. If I wanted to, I could cut that out. So I'm going to take this cane. It's a pretty sizable cane down into the center of the plant. So I'm going to go down as far as I feel comfortable.
Ben, do you mind rotating that a little bit?
Yeah.
Just
like this?
Yeah, just kind of exposing it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've kind of got a center cane here that's a little bit busy. I'm just going to cut that out right above a node. I'll show you all once I cut this out of here. And so there's a cane that's been cut. Again, you do not have to do this. This has been cut in previous years down to here. But by cutting this old mature cane out, you're going to allow it to rejuvenate from the bottom up. I would just do this with plants that are very old, mature. If they get tired looking, you could do some core pruning. This is a good practice on a lot of shrubs that get large and rangy. Just cut out those older canes and let the new ones kind of shine. Again, you're going to lose all these blooms, so be selective with these. My rule of thumb is don't prune these unless it absolutely needs it or if you're trying to shape it. And again, that was oak leaf hydrangea quercifolia. Macrophylla, probably, like I said, the most identifiable hydrangea out there, the big leaf hydrangea. Let me see what I have. Okay, I have a Cardinal Red Hydrangea. And these big leaf hydrangeas, just like the oak leaf hydrangeas, are almost exclusively on old wood. Now, there's a few new varieties that will throw blooms on new fresh wood. But then again, if you don't have to prune these, if they seem fine, you don't need to reduce them. Leaving them alone from year to year will help assure you buds and growth and blooms for the next year. But this one is a little bit busy. So what I wanted to show you is, instead of deadheading or reducing the size of a macrophylla, some of that thinning of old canes is still going to apply here. And specifically this one, because we have so much branch material in the middle, a good thinning is probably going to help with the spread of fungal pathogens, leaf spot. It's just going to open the plant up and allow it to thrive a little more. So we're going to show you a core pruning. I did want to mention the pH. We get questions very constantly on. So the blue and pink colors, these can go to based on your soil acidity. So you can get your soil pH tested. You can send it into the Tennessee Ag Department if you want to contact them for a soil sample kit. But honestly, you can let this thing grow for a year, see what the color is going to be, and then apply a fertilizer if you want it to change. And generally speaking, we're going to use an aluminum sulfate to try to acidify the soil and get these blue, so more acidic blue. And then if we want them more on the pink to red spectrum, we can use a lime or a similar product to lower the soil pH or make it more basic. Like I said, that's not an exact science. Generally, just see what the bloom is and respond. You can plant these with aluminum sulfate to try to guarantee blue blooms. But beyond the color of the bloom, I'm going to show you kind of how to do a little core pruning on this one. So since this is busy, I'm going to try to find some of these canes that are thicker and older and probably going to be less productive next year. So I'm not sure what exactly you can see, but there are some older ones. You can see they've kind of petered out. I'm going to take those down as far to the base of that plant as I can. So you can see kind of a ragged old stem. It's really partially dead. We're going to remove that from the center. Let me do this to a couple more. Again, kind of a mature, scraggly old stem, unproductive. And, I would try to be selective about your cuts. We don't want to make this plant completely bare. We do want blooms next year. So just a selective cut, maybe 30% or less plant material removed out of this for productivity. Here's another really mature one. Let me do that a few more times.
Ben, while you're pruning, we have a question.
Sure.
When do you add sulfate to soil?
Generally, these products aren't really going to release until we're above 50 degrees or so. I would want to wait until spring if you want an immediate response. You could put aluminum sulfate in your soil right now. You're not going to see the results until spring. So if you're out there maintaining your garden right now, have nothing else to do in your garden, you can absolutely amend the soil with aluminum sulfate or a lime to change it. You can wait until spring. If you wait until spring, you may not get a true response out of your blooms that year. It just depends on how acidic or not your soil is. So I'd recommend, now or springtime or fall, just know you're not going to see the change in your soil acidity for probably a few months. So if you do it now, it should release into your soil, start working in. Then when it warms up, you will see the response in your hydrangeas. So now is fine. Spring is fine. Most of these aluminum sulfates don't have nitrogen, so you're not going to be causing your plant to grow out of control. So really any time is the right answer, probably a couple times a year for most of these products. Hollytone has one, and they do have instructions on the bag for that product.
Additionally, we'll have an upcoming webinar next year demystifying fertilizer labels. So we're going to try and break that process down and determine, you know, if you want to add blooms to your hydrangea, this is what you want to kind of go for.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of products out there. I don't think there's just one best product, as long as you use them appropriately, based on the percentage of nutrients and how that maker of a product recommends it. I would just stick with their recommendation, because you get different percentages and levels of nutrients in those. So Espoma products are something we sell a lot of, and they have specific directions for each product. I've kind of done a little bit of core pruning to this Macrophylla. It just looks a little bit cleaner. We're letting sunlight into this. Again, this is a Cardinal Red Hydrangea, big leaf hydrangea. We're going to leave all this because this is going to produce blooms next year. So this is kind of a good look. It should fill in those areas, kind of give it a little bit of life. With fertilizing in mind, fertilizer to help the blooms as far as productivity and size and vigor, I would do that probably mid to late spring after we've had our final frost. So the big thing we don't want to do is over fertilize these early spring and then have them grow and then have them get frost damage. So heavy fertilizer for nitrogen and blooms, wait till late spring on these. We did mention Hydrangea Serrata, the Mountain Hydrangea. Treat that the same as the Macrophylla, the big leaf. Really just the same way of treatment, just a different bloom and a different shape. We did mention the Petiolaris, the climbing hydrangea. Again, treat that as a vine. Really, anytime you want to shape it, prune it back, it'll set blooms on new wood. And just kind of as a secondary example, I do have a hydrangea trained onto a tree here, which is a very popular here at Bates Nursery. So this is a Limelight Hydrangea grafted or grown onto a stem. So we have a stem which is down here below the table. It's sticking up about 3-4 feet, and then we have that shrub on the top of that. So what we're going to do is treat this as a panicle hydrangea from the top of the stem that it's on above. So essentially these could get anywhere between 4 to 8 feet from here up. They can really be quite large. If you want to keep these to scale, these get put into small gardens a lot. I would go ahead and do that 2/3 reduction, like I said. I'll go ahead and show you taking some blooms off of this one because it has a lot on there, and show you how that looks. And then I'll kind of do a little bit of a reduction, which is what we'll typically do here to winterize our plants. Let me grab my pruners here. So we'll kind of do these front blooms. Again, I'm going to prune these at the first node below the bloom.
Ben, if you wouldn't mind going a little slower, just showing where exactly you're pruning.
Mm-hmm. So we have a bloom here. I don't know if you can see that from where you are. So here's a singular bloom. Again, you're not really going to do any damage if you go too far down. But if you just want to give it just the blooms, just the deadheads, just come down from that bloom at least one node and just snip it right above it. We just tend to not like cutting straight between two nodes. So we have a little node with buds here and a little node with buds here. We typically don't like cutting it there, because what we're going to get is dieback all the way here, and you'll end up with some kind of little unsightly brown tips. So what we'll do is go to that node and snip right above it. That'll just give you a cleaner looking plant. It's not really going to change the bloom or the vigor, just the look of the plant. So I'm going to kind of do this to half of the plant. So again, I'm just cutting all of these, just the next node down from the bloom. And again, sharp tools are going to be great. There's no reason not to have a nice sharp tool. It's just going to damage your cuts less, and a cleaner cut just means less disease, a more clean look, and more predictability with what the prune is going to do. So let me
And I
just do
believe-
half of this, and then I'll do a hard prune on the other half.
Ben, I think you also did a webinar back in the summer about pruning. Am I right?
Mhm. Yeah, we did. And, you know, we do reiterate some of these protocols. A good kind of takeaway for all pruning is if you prune directly after bloom time, so the next season. So if we prune in the summer, if we bloom in the summer, we want to prune in the fall. Same thing, if this is a plant that blooms in the spring, we want to prune it in the summer. So if this was a spring blooming plant, we would not want to be doing this. These bloom in summer, we're just fine. But yes, we did a pruning webinar. That's a great resource for just general pruning for all different species of plants. But if we can get more specific, we'll definitely do one. If there's a topic y'all really want to know more about, more in depth, let us know, and we'll try to do a webinar on it. So let me get back to where y'all can see it.
Also, thank you all for your questions.
Yeah.
We'll get to a portion later on where we can answer them.
Yeah, and we'll have time here. We're almost done with kind of this, and we'll open up to questions. Just wanted to see if y'all could see, you know, blooms here, and then we've just deadheaded this part of the hydrangea, so just cleaning it up a little bit. I mean, you can get as detailed as you want with cutting these little blooms off. I'm going to do a 2/3 prune on the other side. So if you really want to tighten this plant up, you really want to keep it growing to the same spot every year, you can take 2/3 off of it. So let me screw this around. So if you can see this, you can see just like the other Limelight that we are going down to kind of the previous cuts, and where they've been cut before is a good guide for us. So I like to go to those nodes or just below it. It really doesn't matter, just to really tighten this plant up. So we're going to go down and go right above our previous nodes. You can see we're cutting a lot more off of these. And I'm not sure what this is going to look like with half reduction and half deadhead, but we're going to try it and see if y'all can see the difference. Now this can be kind of messy in the garden. Usually I'll bring a tarp with me and just throw these on the tarp, making cleanup a lot easier. Because if you're cleaning up your bed for winter, for the holidays, you don't want it to look like more of a mess than it was when you started. So a tarp or one of the rubber tubs we sell are great to keep with you while you're doing this.
Tub trugs.
Tub trugs. I know, it's a tongue twister. I always get them backwards. Gorilla tubs. So again, we're coming back. We can see these old previous nodes. I'm coming right above them. You could easily go right below them. It's not really, it's more of a personal preference. So I'm going to keep going, just a few more.
Ben, what was the name of the book that you're using?
It is a Michael Durr book. I believe it was released in 2011. Let me see. I'll show it here. It was the Encyclopedia of Trees and Shrubs. It's kind of a companion to the more textbook version, which is just black and white. You'll hear plantsmen refer to it as the Plant Bible. It's just immense and thousands of pages. This is a little more succinct. And I believe you should be able to find it for under $100, and a lot of times used a little bit less than that. But it's great if you really want a full color reference. Durr is typically based out of Georgia, so he's a great reference for our area because that's where he studies most of his plants. So a great resource if you just want to dig deeper. Great Christmas gift if you have just a plant enthusiast. It's a great place to start if you're just curious about different plants. And we normally don't see plants mature here on the lot, so it's nice to see pictures of what these plants are going to look like. Okay, so I'm almost done with this guy. I will mention any damaged branches that you have, broken branches. This is a good time to just snip those off. If you have a damaged, broken branch, there's no reason to keep it. We don't want that plant to put energy into that. So anything damaged, broken, just go ahead and snip that off. Okay, let me kind of turn this to the side so y'all can see the difference. Again, this is a Limelight Hydrangea trained onto a tree stem. Okay, so this was the part that I just deadheaded. So we just took the blooms off just below the bloom, typically to the first or second node, just to clean up the plant, make it look a little nicer in the winter. These mushy blooms can get pretty nasty with a frost and rain. And on the other half, I did a 2/3 reduction pruning. So you can see just a little bit looser. This will probably grow 2 or 3 foot this year or the next year. And then this will grow about 2 or 3 foot from here. So if you want to keep your plant tighter, you can easily do this every year, every other year, as often as you need. Both of these will bloom next year. It's just this will be a little bit tighter. So kind of pleased with how you can see that. So again, both of these are totally okay for a panicle hydrangea. Deadhead versus hard cutbacks as much as 2/3. And another benefit to pruning right now is we don't have insects or disease that could get into the plant. We're not having to worry about pest problems. It's a pretty safe time to prune. All right, I think I've touched on just about everything that I had prepared. So now that I've made a mess, let's open it up to questions.
Okay, let's see here. I have to move a hydrangea tree. Tips?
Yeah, I didn't mention transplanting. Now is a great time to transplant. I would wait until you have just about no leaves, no blooms on that plant, till everything's done, till it's dormant. So really from here through the winter is a good time. Depending on how old that tree is, you should come out probably a couple feet from the trunk and start digging around it. It's okay if you cut a few roots, but just try to get up underneath that hydrangea tree and get as much of that root material as you can before transplanting it. Obviously, dig a nice big hole to where you're putting it, loosen it up, and fill that in around it. One of the benefits to doing transplanting right now is these plants are not actively growing, so we're not going to damage new growth. We're not going to damage its root system as much transplanting it right now. You know, if your hydrangea tree is over 4 or 5 years old, it's probably going to be difficult. But if it's a more recent tree within the past few years, you shouldn't have any trouble transplanting it. You might put a stake with it when you transplant it because it might be weak at first. If it's not freezing weather, water it in whenever you plant it, and then just kind of let it go and see what happens in the spring. Maybe a little bit of fertilizer in the spring.
Additionally, pruning of Big Daddy Hydrangea and Twist and Shout.
Yep. So Big Daddy and Twist and Shout, I believe those are both Macrophylla. I believe Twist and Shout is Macrophylla, not Serrata. I could be mistaken, actually. Let me just look.
And I'm going to switch the camera back over here so we can see.
But yeah, both of those, treat them as Macrophylla. So it was asked about pruning of those.
That's correct. Yep. Big Daddy and Twist and Shout.
Yep. Yep.
And if you could center the book up a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
And just a little bit over to your left.
I think I had Twist and Shout on here. Let me see. I think I did see one. Yeah, so there's Twist and Shout Macrophylla. That's going to be kind of more what people call a mop head, or sorry, a lace cap, not a mop head. So these we're just going to treat as any other Macrophylla. The less pruning you can do on these, the better. So they're pretty much going to be on old wood. The Twist and Shout, I believe, is supposed to be a rebloomer, but still, the less pruning you can do, the better. I would do more of that core pruning if you have to, if it's really busy and old and thick. Just if you prune it too much right now, you do risk skipping a year of blooms. So I would leave them alone if you can. Deadhead them at the most. I would not do any big hard reduction prunings on the Big Daddy or the Twist and Shout. Like I said, if you have to do a big reduction, just know you're probably going to lose blooms for a season, which is not a problem. They'll still be healthy. You're just going to forego that for a year. So as little as possible. Again, let me pull out. We talked about the Cardinal Red, which is another big leaf hydrangea like Big Daddy. Just thinning out some of the old canes to try to get better bloom production on these canes that are here is what I would be doing on those. Like I said, less is more with those two varieties. If you don't need to do anything to them, that's the best thing you can do.
All right. Do you deadhead on all, regardless of old wood or new wood?
Deadheading is really just for aesthetics. It's not really going to help produce more vigorous blooms the next year. And most plants will kind of self-deadhead in the spring when they grow. It's really just for you as the landscaper, the gardener, to have it look cleaner through the winter. You know, they can look really ratty, these hydrangeas with a lot of big blooms. The wetter and colder it gets, the more mushy they get and messy. So that deadheading is really solely just for the look of the plant through the winter. You could easily deadhead them early fall and then do a hard cutback late in the winter just because you want to see the height of it. That's not a problem. Don't feel like you need to deadhead. You know, some of us want to do as little as possible. Definitely not a requirement, but again, just for looks.
Let's see. I have an Annabelle that's huge, probably 6 to 7 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
It has gorgeous leaves, but few blooms.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deal?
Annabelle hydrangeas, a couple things they do prefer. They really don't like intense sun. And then they also don't like excessive moisture. So apart from a good cutback, again, Annabelle and Arborescens hydrangea, I wouldn't hesitate to cut those down really far. I mean, 4 to 6 inches from the ground is totally okay with those. You're just going to get a tighter, shorter plant. And if you cut that Annabelle down to the ground, you're going to see a much more vigorous growth from the base, and it'll put more energy into those blooms. So, again, if it's in too much sun or it's too wet, those are the two things that can really reduce the overall health of the plant from year to year. But if excessive water is not a problem, just a really hard cut back with those Annabelles. And my favorite thing to do is to cut those things back. I mean, literally in half mid-year, and you can get a second set of new blooms apart from just a general fertilizer. So Annabelles, cut those things 4 to 6 inches from the ground is what I would do.
All right. Best time to prune Limelight, and how much?
Yep. So Limelight, like we were saying, right now is kind of go time for hydrangeas, just about all of them. Limelight, you could prune those as early as late summer if you're just deadheading. But really right now, and just like that tree that we showed you, the Limelight tree, we could treat the shrubs the same way. So again, if you're just doing it to make it look cleaner through the winter with the Limelight, just deadhead them as early as late summer after they bloom if you don't like the look of them. And then a hard cutback. If you really want to reduce the size of your Limelight year to year, you could cut it back 2/3 every year. I would wait until about now, late fall through the winter. That way we're not telling it to push new growth when we cut it. So again, late summer through the winter, deadheading for Limelight, hard cutback to keep it tighter and to make it a little bit smaller. late fall through winter.
Excellent. I have 2 hydrangea plants under a pin oak, and they've never bloomed. Time to move? Is it too cold now? And when is another time to move, if so?
No, it's a good time to move. It being under an oak tree, digging it up around the roots of that oak is probably going to be difficult. But it's very common, specifically the pink to blue, the Macrophylla, the big leaf hydrangeas. I see those really start to peter out if they're in too much shade. Sometimes we think, oh, hydrangeas like shade, but in all actuality, those Macrophyllas, if that's the hydrangea you have, could really stand to be moved out into more sun. If you're seeing less and less bloom production or none at all, get that thing out into more sun. If it's Macrophylla, you could probably put it in 6 hours of sun if it gets a break in the afternoon. So yeah, pull it out from that oak tree to where it's not underneath that canopy. I would do it right now. As soon as you really don't have any leaves, you're left with just sticks. That's when I would dig it up, transplant it. As far as the cold goes, I would try to pick a day where it's not well below freezing, but there really isn't any problem in transplanting through the winter.
All right. Several of my older endless summers have not bloomed well for 2 years. I do cover them for late freezes. In spring, they don't have too much sun. Thoughts?
Yeah. And again, it's the sun where with the Macrophyllas and actually the endless summer specifically, the problems with them blooming from year to year a lot of times have to do with too little sun. Now, if you thin that plant out from the core, it can let more sun into the leaves. But if it's just reduced blooms every year and we're getting more and more shade, typically the endless summers are getting too much shade for a really nice bloom. Out here on the lot, we'll actually have them out in the sun all the way up until about midsummer when we'll put a shade tarp on. So making sure, again, they're not too wet like the Annabelle. If they're too wet, they're just going to struggle to put good, new, healthy growth on, and they're going to die back. So watching your moisture and your light levels. In my opinion, endless summers could really be in full sun, and I think they're going to look the best. So whatever you can do to get that hydrangea in a sunnier location should help. And also fertilizing. If you haven't fertilized in a while, maybe this spring, give it a little boost. Just some general fertilizer. You can use Miracle Grow, Osmocote. Anything with 10 to 20% nitrogen would be good in the spring.
Okay. What fertilizer do you recommend, and do you work it in around the drip line?
Yeah, I mean, you don't really need to work the fertilizers in unless you're planting the tree fresh, and then it's always good to put it in the hole as you're mixing it. But if this plant's established, maybe if you're going to mulch, put that down initially. The drip line is a really good rule of thumb. So on this oak leaf, if we're talking drip line, that's where the leaves kind of end, where the rain is going to kind of stop dripping off of this plant. We kind of want to aim for fertilizer just around that drip line. So, 2, 3, 4 foot out from the center of the plant. As long as that fertilizer will stay in that location and you don't have runoff issues, you don't need to mix it in. It's not really a big deal. Again, if you're going to mulch, you might do it before you mulch. That way it holds it into the soil. But typically, as soon as it rains or you water, that will work its way in. Just generally for hydrangeas, you could use just a plant tone product. Again, I really like an Osmocote product in my garden because it's just a coated fertilizer that will release for 4 or 5 months. You could also use a general bedding plant food. I would just aim for things 20% nitrogen or less. Any fertilizer you're using with more than 20% nitrogen risks burning the plant and putting excessive new growth on, not excessive, not necessarily blooms or root growth, just tissue growth, which is not going to help the blooms of our hydrangeas. So springtime is ideal, and then again in the early fall to fertilize these. Really any fertilizer 20% or below nitrogen would work on a hydrangea. Work it in if you can, but definitely water it.
Next one. I have two Annabelles that are in the space between the sidewalk and the house, maybe 4 foot by 8 foot. And they've never bloomed in 6 years. I cut them back in the winter hoping for blooms, but I'm wondering if maybe they're too crowded and that's what's preventing them from blooming.
It could be. The only thing that will concern me with an Annabelle when I hear that they're near sidewalks, hard surfaces, Annabelle's really are one of the few hydrangeas I recommend for a shadier spot. If they're getting too much heat and too much sun, it could basically it could burn the roots if it's that close to a hard surface, or it could burn the buds and the blooms and the leaves off and just reduce the health of that plant. You know, if you're cutting it back this time of year, that is the right thing to do. But again, we're going to look at water issues. So is it getting too hot and dry, or is it staying too wet? Is there too much mulch up on that plant so it's holding moisture around the base of it? Too much moisture or too much sun would both be problems with Annabelle. So just take a look and see if there's too much moisture, too much mulch in that bed, or the sun and the heat from the sidewalk would definitely be a problem for Annabelle.
Well, I want to thank everybody for their questions. If you have any more, please email info@batesnursery.com. Feel free to get detailed, include photos, because we really need those to identify most of the issues. Anything else? If you're looking for a hydrangea or even any plant to source, special orders at batesnursery.com. We can help you get those. We're going to be, obviously next year is when we'll be really shipping plants in, but just, start making a list and check back with us.
Yep. And we've got plenty of hydrangeas. We do put them away for winter, but our selection may not be the best right now because we kind of stopped bringing in plants, but that does not mean it's a bad time to plant. Keep your eyes out. We just got done with a deciduous tree sale. So, we would love to get these plants put in the ground. All of our hydrangeas are warranted. So if you're a little nervous about putting a hydrangea in the ground over the winter, we will definitely take care of those if there's any problems. Great time to plant. Great time to cut your hydrangea.